August 9th, 1945. The war was over. Silence fell across a shattered empire. American soldiers landed on Japanese soil, expecting ruins, expecting surrender, expecting perhaps the remnants of a once proud military machine. What they found instead, in a remote valley north of Kyoto, made hardened veterans weep. Behind rusting gates and beneath layers of ash and secrecy lay evidence of something so monstrous that even those who had witnessed the horrors of Iwo Jima and Okinawa could scarcely believe their eyes. What crime had been hidden in the mountains? What truth was so terrible that an entire nation had conspired to bury it? And how did one American chaplain's curiosity unravel a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of the Japanese imperial government? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The summer heat pressed down on Kyoto like a heavy hand. August 15th had brought Emperor Hirohito's voice crackling over radio waves, thin and reedy, announcing what most Japanese citizens had refused to believe possible. The war was finished. The divine empire had fallen. In the days that followed, an eerie stillness settled over the islands. Factories went silent. Soldiers laid down rifles that had been promised to fight until the last breath. Children who had been trained to sharpen bamboo spears for the final invasion now stood confused in empty schoolyards. For the Americans, victory brought a strange mixture of relief and uncertainty. The battles had ended, but occupation was only beginning. Troops who had prepared for a bloody assault on the home islands now found themselves boarding transport ships, not as invaders, but as administrators. Their mission had shifted from destruction to reconstruction, from combat to control. Among these men, few understood what they would truly encounter in the weeks ahead. Captain Robert Hartley was not a warrior by training. A minister from Portland, Maine, he had enlisted as a chaplain in 1943, driven by a sense of duty and a belief that even in war, souls needed tending. He had served with the 4th Marine Division, moving through the hell of Saipan and Tinian, offering what comfort he could to men who saw things no human should witness. Hartley was a tall man, gaunt from months of Pacific rations, with kind eyes that had seen too much death. His faith had been tested in those campaigns, shaken by the things men did to one another, but it had not broken. He believed in redemption, in the possibility that even from the ashes of war, something decent could emerge. Now, in late August 1945, Hartley stood on the deck of a transport vessel approaching Yokohama Harbor. Around him, young Marines joked nervously, their weapons slung but ready. The tension was palpable. They had heard rumors of fanatics, of last stands, of kamikaze pilots who might yet hurl themselves from hidden airfields. But as the ship glided into port, what struck Hartley most was the silence. No gunfire, no explosions, just the gentle lap of water against concrete, and the sight of a city reduced to rubble. The occupation forces fanned out quickly. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, established headquarters in Tokyo and began issuing directives with the efficiency of a man who had waited years for this moment. Military government teams spread across the country, tasked with disarming soldiers, cataloging weapons, securing facilities, and beginning the long process of demilitarization. It was a monumental undertaking. Japan was not merely defeated, it was devastated. Cities lay in ruins, infrastructure was shattered, millions faced starvation. Yet beneath the surface of this broken nation, secrets festered. The Japanese military had been thorough in its final days. Documents were burned, evidence was destroyed. Officers who knew too much were reassigned to remote posts or simply vanished.
Could read them. For most occupying forces, this went unnoticed. They were too busy dealing with immediate concerns, food distribution, medical care, maintaining order among a population teetering on the edge of chaos. Captain Hartley was assigned to a unit responsible for inspecting former military installations in the Kansai region. His role was unusual for a chaplain. He was to accompany teams as they entered bases, arsenals, and training facilities, not to fight, but to observe, to document, and occasionally to offer guidance when the men encountered scenes that tested their humanity. It was during one of these routine inspections that the first thread began to unravel. September brought cooler air to the mountains north of Kyoto. The city itself had been spared the firebombing that had consumed Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya, a decision made by American planners who recognized its cultural significance. But the surrounding valleys, dotted with small villages and agricultural land, had seen their share of military activity. Intelligence reports indicated the presence of several research facilities in the area, though details were scarce. The Japanese had been careful to keep certain operations away from prying eyes, tucked into hillsides where American reconnaissance planes would see nothing but forest and farmland. On the morning of September 7th, Hartley rode in the back of a truck with a team of 6 Marines and a Japanese interpreter named Takeshi Yamamoto. Yamamoto was a Nisei, born in California but educated partly in Japan before the war. He had spent the conflict in a peculiar limbo. His family interned while he worked for military intelligence, his loyalty constantly questioned. Now he served as a bridge between two worlds, translating not just words, but the cultural chasms that separated occupier from occupied. The truck rumbled along a dirt road that wound through dense cedar forests. Hartley watched the landscape pass, struck by its beauty. It seemed impossible that such a place had been part of the machinery of war. They were headed to a site designated on their maps simply as Facility 19. Intelligence knew little about it, except that it had been operated by the Imperial Japanese Army until mid-August. Aerial photographs showed a cluster of buildings surrounded by high fences, but the purpose was unclear. The team's orders were straightforward: secure the site, catalog any remaining equipment, and report back. As they approached, the forest gave way to a clearing. Ahead, rusting gates stood slightly ajar. Beyond them, a collection of low concrete buildings squatted in the afternoon light. The place had an abandoned feel, as though everyone had left in a hurry. The truck stopped outside the gates. The Marines dismounted, weapons ready, eyes scanning for threats. Hartley climbed down more slowly, his boots crunching on gravel. Sergeant Daniels, a stocky man from Ohio with a face that had seen too many beaches, motioned for the team to spread out. Yamamoto called out in Japanese, announcing their presence, demanding that anyone inside come forward with hands raised. There was no response. Only the wind rustling through trees and the distant cry of a bird. They entered cautiously. The first building appeared to be administrative. Inside, desks sat empty, papers scattered across floors, filing cabinets pulled open and ransacked. Someone had been through here, taking what mattered and leaving the rest. Hartley ran his fingers over a desk, collecting dust. The air smelled of mildew and something else, something faintly chemical that made his nose wrinkle. The team moved deeper into the compound. Behind the administrative building stood larger structures, windowless and heavy. One had a reinforced steel door, sealed but not locked. Daniel signaled 2 Marines forward. They pulled the door open, hinges screeching in protest. Darkness yawned beyond. Flashlights clicked on, beams cutting through the gloom. What they found inside made them pause. Rows of metal tables, stained and pitted. Glass cabinets containing instruments that gleamed dully in the flashlight beams.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Hartley stepped closer, trying to make sense of it. It looked medical, but wrong somehow. The tables were fitted with restraints. The instruments, surgical but cruder than anything he had seen in field hospitals. There were drains in the floor, dark stains leading toward them. One Marine, a kid barely 20 named Collins, bent down near a cabinet. He reached inside and pulled out a jar. Inside, suspended in yellowish liquid, was something that made him drop it instantly. The jar shattered. Liquid spread across the floor. Hartley saw what had been inside and felt his stomach lurch. It was a human organ, preserved, labeled in Japanese characters. Yamamoto translated the label, his voice tight. Liver. Male. Age approximately 25. Experiment 37. The room fell silent. The Marines exchanged glances. Daniel swore softly. Hartley felt a chill despite the warm air. This was not a hospital. This was something else entirely. They found more jars, more labels. Lungs, kidneys, sections of intestine, all preserved, all tagged with clinical precision. On one wall hung charts detailing procedures in meticulous handwriting. Hartley could not read Japanese, but Yamamoto's face grew paler with each document he examined. When pressed, the interpreter shook his head, struggling to find words. "These are not medical records," Yamamoto said quietly. "These are experiments on living subjects." The weight of those words settled over the team like a shroud. Living subjects. Hartley thought of the camps he had heard whispers about, the stories from Europe of unspeakable acts. He had prayed those were exaggerations, the product of wartime propaganda. Now, standing in this cold room with its jars of flesh and its stained tables, he realized that humanity's capacity for darkness was not limited by geography or ideology. They pressed on, documenting everything. Daniels ordered photographs taken, though none of the men relished the task. In another building they found cells, small, cramped with heavy doors and tiny barred windows. The walls were scratched with marks, desperate tallies perhaps, or prayers carved by fingernails. In one cell, a single shoe lay abandoned. In another, a child's doll, filthy and torn. Hartley stood in the corridor between these cells, his breath shallow. Who had been kept here? Prisoners of war? Civilians? The questions churned in his mind, each more terrible than the last. He had seen death in combat, had held dying men in his arms and whispered prayers as their lives slipped away. But this was different. This was calculated. This was evil distilled to its essence. By the time they finished their initial survey, the sun was sinking toward the horizon. The team regrouped outside, exhausted and shaken. Daniels radioed back to headquarters, his report terse but urgent. They needed specialists, investigators, people who could make sense of what they had found. This was beyond a routine inspection. This was evidence of crimes that defied comprehension. That night, Hartley sat alone in a commandeered building in Kyoto, unable to sleep. His mind replayed the images from the facility, the jars, the tables, the cells. He thought of the men and women who had suffered there, whose final moments had been recorded in neat handwriting on laboratory charts. He thought of the people who had done this, who had walked into those rooms each day and performed their duties with clinical detachment. How did one become capable of such things? What broke inside a person that they could inflict such suffering and feel nothing? Faith, Hartley had always believed, was a refuge, but tonight it felt fragile. He opened his Bible, searching for comfort, but the words blurred. He prayed, not for understanding but for strength, for the ability to face whatever truths tomorrow would bring. Because he knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that Facility 19 was not an isolated case.
If this existed, if this had been allowed to happen, then there were more secrets buried in this country, more crimes hidden beneath layers of ash and silence.
With a larger team, they brought medical personnel, intelligence officers, and more interpreters. The site was cordoned off, declared off-limits to all but authorized personnel. Over the following days, investigators worked systematically through the buildings, piecing together a narrative from the fragments left behind. What emerged was a picture of a program that had operated for years. Facility 19 had been one node in a network, a place where the boundaries of medicine and morality had been obliterated in the name of research. The subjects, investigators learned, had been Chinese prisoners, Korean laborers, captured Allied airmen, and sometimes Japanese citizens deemed expendable. They had been infected with diseases, exposed to chemical agents, subjected to surgeries without anesthesia, all to gather data. The justification, in the minds of those who ran the facility, was strategic. Knowledge gained could save Japanese soldiers. The suffering of a few was acceptable if it served the empire. Hartley read the reports with growing horror. The experiments ranged from the barbaric to the incomprehensible. Frostbite studies where limbs were frozen and thawed repeatedly. Vivisections performed on conscious patients to observe organ function. Pressure chamber tests that ruptured lungs and eyes. The detail was meticulous. Every scream, every convulsion, every moment of agony had been noted, recorded, analyzed. But perhaps the most chilling aspect was the bureaucracy. This had not been the work of rogue sadists. It had been sanctioned, funded, overseen by men in Tokyo who wore uniforms adorned with medals. Orders had flowed down through proper channels. Reports had flowed back up. The machinery of the state had turned, and in its gears, thousands had been ground to nothing. As the investigation widened, more facilities were discovered. Some were larger, more sophisticated. Others were hastily abandoned, their evidence burned but not thoroughly enough. Survivors began to surface, men and women who had somehow endured, who bore scars both visible and invisible. Their testimonies, given haltingly through interpreters, painted a picture of systematic cruelty that spanned years. Hartley interviewed several survivors, though the task left him drained. One man, a former Chinese soldier named WWII, described being captured near Shanghai in 1942. He had been transported to a facility he knew only as the place of screams. There, doctors in white coats had injected him with substances that made his body burn with fever. He remembered being strapped to a table, unable to move as they cut into him to observe his organs. He survived because, inexplicably, they decided he was more useful alive for further tests. When the war ended, his captors had fled, leaving him and a handful of others locked in cells. American soldiers had found them 3 days later, skeletal and delirious. Listening to WWII, Hartley felt something shift inside him. Anger, yes, but also a profound sadness. This man's suffering had been inflicted by people who believed they were serving a greater good. That was perhaps the most disturbing realization. The perpetrators were not monsters in the traditional sense. They were educated, cultured individuals who had convinced themselves that their actions were justified. They had families, hobbies, beliefs. And yet, they had done this. The question that haunted Hartley was why? Why had this been allowed to happen? He began digging into the background, speaking with Japanese officials who had been cooperative, reading captured documents that intelligence teams translated. What he discovered was a culture of obedience and a philosophy of utility that had twisted over the course of the war. In the early years of the conflict, Japan had been ascendant, conquering vast territories with relative ease. The military had grown confident, almost arrogant. Scientific research was prioritized, seen as a way to maintain the edge over enemies. Biological and chemical weapons programs were expanded, pushed by officers who believed such weapons could break the will of China and eventually the Western powers. Ethical concerns were dismissed. The subjects of experiments were viewed not as human beings, but as resources, as tools to advance the empire's goals. This mindset was not unique to Japan. Hartley knew enough history to understand that atrocities were a human failing, not a national one. The difference here was scale and systematization. The program had been vast, involving hundreds of personnel, thousands of victims, and the tacit approval of military leadership. It had been, in the most grotesque sense, a success in its own terms. Data had been gathered, knowledge had been acquired, and until the very end, it had remained hidden from the world. By mid-September, the scope of the discoveries was becoming clear to higher command. MacArthur's headquarters received detailed reports. The question now was what to do with this information. Publicly exposing the full extent of the crimes would shock the world, but it would also complicate the occupation. Japan was to be rebuilt, transformed into a democratic ally. Dwelling on the darkest chapters of its recent past might inflame tensions, hinder cooperation, or even provoke unrest. There were debates, arguments behind closed doors that Hartley was not privy to, but heard about through the grapevine. Some officers argued for full disclosure, for trials that would hold the perpetrators accountable. Others counseled pragmatism, suggesting that justice could be selective, that the focus should be on moving forward rather than dwelling on the past. It was a debate as old as war itself, the tension between retribution and reconciliation. Hartley found himself pulled in different directions. As a man of faith, he believed in accountability, in the idea that sins must be acknowledged and atoned for. But as a pragmatist, he understood the complexities of the situation. Japan was shattered. Its people were hungry, traumatized, uncertain of their future. Pushing too hard might break what little remained. Yet how could such crimes go unanswered? How could the survivors, the families of the dead, find peace without justice? He wrestled with these questions alone, pacing his small quarters late into the night. There were no easy answers. Faith offered comfort, but not clarity. Scripture spoke of justice and mercy, of forgiveness and consequences, but reconciling those principles in the face of such horror was beyond him. One evening in late September, Hartley was summoned to a meeting at headquarters. He arrived to find a room full of officers, intelligence personnel, and a few civilians who had been brought in as consultants. The mood was tense. A colonel he did not recognize stood at the front, gesturing to a map covered with pins marking locations of discovered facilities. The colonel's briefing was blunt. They had identified at least 20 sites connected to the program. Some were small, others sprawling complexes. The estimated number of victims ranged from 10,000 to over 20,000, though exact figures would likely never be known. The program had operated under various code names, all designed to obscure its true purpose. The men who ran it had been methodical, careful, and until the very end, confident of their immunity. Now, the colonel said, decisions had to be made. Who would be prosecuted? What evidence would be used? How much would be revealed to the public? There were strategic considerations. Some of the scientists involved had expertise that could be valuable. The Cold War was already looming, and knowledge, even knowledge gained through atrocity, was a commodity. Hartley listened, his discomfort growing. The room felt cold despite the press of bodies. He raised his hand, and the colonel nodded toward him. "Chaplain, you have something to add." Hartley stood slowly. "I have been interviewing survivors. I have seen the facilities. I have read the reports, and I have to ask, sir, if we do not hold these men accountable, what message does that send to the victims, to the world, to ourselves?" The room went quiet. The colonel regarded him for a long moment before responding.
Chaplain, we are all aware of the moral dimension here, but this is not a Sunday sermon. This is occupation policy. We have to balance justice with practicality." Hartley felt the heat rise in his face, but kept his voice steady. "I understand practicality, sir, but I also understand that some things cannot be compromised. These were not acts of war. They were acts of depravity. If we let them slide in the name of expediency, we become complicit." The colonel's expression hardened. "Watch your tone, Chaplain. We are all doing our best in a difficult situation." Hartley sat down, his heart pounding. He had spoken out of turn, and he knew it, but he did not regret it. Silence in the face of such evil was its own sin. The meeting continued, decisions deferred, positions staked out. When it ended, Hartley left quickly, stepping into the cool night air. He walked aimlessly through the streets of Kyoto, past buildings that stood untouched by fire, past temples where incense still burned, past people who moved through the darkness like ghosts. He thought about the survivors, about WWII and the others whose stories had been entrusted to him. He thought about the perpetrators, men who, even now, were likely living quietly, hoping to disappear into the chaos of defeat. And he thought about the choice that lay ahead, not just for the occupation authorities, but for history itself. Would this be remembered? Would the victims be honored? Or would expediency win, as it so often did, and the truth be buried beneath layers of pragmatism and strategic interest? Days turned into weeks. October arrived, bringing cooler weather and the first hints of autumn color to the trees. The investigation continued, now involving specialists from Washington, lawyers who debated the finer points of international law, and journalists who had begun to catch wind of the story. There were leaks, whispers, rumors that spread through the ranks. Some soldiers wanted the truth out, others feared what it might mean. Hartley continued his work, documenting, interviewing, bearing witness. It was exhausting, emotionally draining in a way that combat had not been. In battle, the enemy was clear. Here, the lines were blurred. He met Japanese civilians who claimed ignorance, who insisted they had no idea what was happening in those remote facilities. He met officers who defended their actions, who argued that war necessitated hard choices. And he met a very few, who expressed remorse, who admitted that what had been done was wrong, that no justification could erase the suffering inflicted. One such man was a doctor named Hideaki Tanaka. Tanaka had worked at Facility 19 for 2 years before being transferred to another site. When American investigators tracked him down, he did not flee or deny. He simply sat in his modest home, surrounded by medical texts, and answered their questions with a calm detachment that Hartley found unsettling. Tanaka described his work without emotion. He had been ordered to conduct experiments on prisoners. He had done so. He had recorded the results. When asked if he felt guilt, Tanaka paused, then said that guilt was a luxury he could not afford. He had been a soldier, following orders. If he had refused, someone else would have taken his place, and he would have been punished. The system, he said, was larger than any individual. Hartley, sitting across from Tanaka, felt a wave of frustration. "That is not an answer," he said. "You had a choice. Every person has a choice." Tanaka shook his head. "You do not understand, Chaplain. In Japan, the individual does not matter. The group, the nation, the emperor, these are what matter. I was taught this from childhood. To disobey was to betray everything I was raised to believe. You may call me a monster, but I was simply a man trying to survive in a world where morality was defined by those above me." Drew to a close, the pressure to make final decisions intensified. Trials were being organized. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal was preparing to prosecute major figures for crimes against peace and humanity. But the scientists, the doctors, the men who had run the experiments were a separate question. Some argued they should face the same tribunal. Others suggested quieter proceedings, or even immunity in exchange for cooperation. Hartley attended another meeting, this one smaller, more select. A general he had never met before laid out the situation plainly. Some of the men involved in the program had agreed to share their data with American researchers. The information, while gained through reprehensible means, was scientifically valuable. In exchange for this cooperation, they would be granted immunity from prosecution. The room erupted in argument. Some officers were outraged. Others saw the logic. The general raised a hand for silence. "This is not a moral question anymore," he said. "This is a strategic one. The Soviets are already gathering intelligence on similar programs. If we do not secure this knowledge, they will. And in the new world we are entering, that knowledge could save American lives." Hartley stood again, his voice shaking. "And what of the victims? What do we tell them? That their suffering was worth it because we got useful data? That justice is negotiable?" The general met his gaze without flinching. "Chaplain, I respect your convictions, but war is about choices, hard choices. We cannot save everyone, and we cannot punish everyone. We do what we must to protect our own." Hartley left that meeting knowing he had lost. The decision had already been made. The wheels were in motion. Some men would be prosecuted, token figures to satisfy the demand for justice, but others would walk free, their crimes erased by the value of their knowledge. It was a bargain struck in shadows, a compromise that would haunt those who made it. In the weeks that followed, the story began to leak. Journalists pieced together fragments, published articles that hinted at the full scope but lacked the official confirmation needed to make it a scandal. The public, still reeling from the end of the war, from the revelations of the Holocaust, from the atomic bombings, absorbed the news with a kind of numbed exhaustion. There was only so much horror one could process. Hartley, meanwhile, continued his work. He compiled reports, gathered testimonies, created a record that he hoped would endure. He knew the official narrative would be sanitized, shaped by political necessity. But he also believed that truth had a way of surviving, even when buried. Future generations, he hoped, would uncover what had been hidden, would ask the questions that his own era refused to confront. By November, the cold had settled in. Kyoto's temples were dusted with the first snow. Hartley stood in one such temple, alone, staring at a statue of the Buddha. The serene face offered no answers, only the same enigmatic calm that had endured for centuries. He thought about all he had seen, all he had learned, the capacity for cruelty, the ease with which humans rationalized the unthinkable, the fragility of morality when confronted with power and fear. And yet, he also thought about the survivors, about their resilience, about the way WWII had looked him in the eye and said simply that he wanted the world to know. That was all. Not revenge, not wealth, just acknowledgement. Just the assurance that his suffering had not been meaningless, that someone, somewhere, would remember. Hartley made a decision that day. He would remember. He would carry these stories with him, bear witness in whatever small way he could. The official machinery might grind toward its compromised conclusions, but he would not forget. He would not let the world forget. The hidden crime that American soldiers had stumbled upon in the mountains north of Kyoto was not just a series of atrocities committed in the name of science. It was a mirror, reflecting the darkest capabilities of humanity when unchecked by conscience or law. Walked out of the temple into the cold November air, he understood that the true horror was not just what had been done, but how easily it had been allowed to happen, how swiftly it was being swept aside, and how little stood between civilization and the abyss. The story was far from over. The decisions made in those months would echo for decades, shaping policy, influencing justice, and leaving questions that would never be fully answered. But for now, in this moment, Hartley carried the weight of what he knew, a burden he would bear for the rest of his life. The hidden crime had been found, but the reckoning, the true reckoning, was yet to come. December winds swept through Tokyo with a bitter edge, carrying with them the smoke from countless fires where families huddled for warmth. The city remained a skeletal landscape of twisted metal and charred foundations, yet life persisted in the cracks. Markets sprang up in ruins. Children played among rubble. The defeated nation stirred, slowly, toward an uncertain future. Within this transformation, the question of accountability grew more complex with each passing day. Captain Robert Hartley found himself at the center of a struggle he had never anticipated. The evidence gathered from Facility 19 and the other sites had been cataloged, organized, and presented to various levels of command. The sheer volume was staggering: thousands of pages of documents, hundreds of photographs, testimonies from survivors that filled entire binders. And yet, as December progressed, Hartley watched with growing dismay as the momentum for justice began to slow, then stall, then reverse. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal had opened in late November with great fanfare. International judges sat in judgment of Japan's highest military and political leaders. The proceedings were broadcast, photographed, reported on by journalists from around the world. It was meant to be a moment of reckoning, a public accounting for the crimes of war. But beneath the surface, deals were being negotiated, compromises struck, priorities reassessed. Hartley received a summons in early December to meet with a civilian consultant named Dr. Edwin Marsh. Marsh was a bacteriologist from Yale, brought to Japan specifically to evaluate the scientific data recovered from the facilities. They met in a nondescript office building that had somehow survived the firebombing, its walls cracked but standing. Marsh was a small man with wire-rimmed glasses and the perpetually distracted air of someone whose mind operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Marsh wasted no time on pleasantries. "Chaplain Hartley, I have reviewed your reports extensively. Your documentation has been invaluable. However, I need to be frank with you about where things stand." Hartley settled into a chair across from the scientist. "I have been hearing rumors. I would appreciate clarity." Marsh removed his glasses, polished them absently, then replaced them. "The data recovered from these facilities is extraordinary. Morally repugnant in its acquisition, yes, but scientifically significant. We're talking about years of research into biological agents, human physiology under extreme conditions, pathogen transmission rates, information that would take decades to replicate through ethical means, if it could be replicated at all." Hartley felt ice forming in his chest. "You are suggesting we use it?" Marsh held up a hand. "I am not suggesting anything. I am explaining reality. There are elements within the government, within the military, who believe this information is too valuable to discard. They argue that refusing to utilize it does not undo the suffering. The victims cannot be brought back, but their deaths could, theoretically, contribute to saving future lives." "And the men who conducted these experiments," Hartley said, his voice tight, "what happens to them?" Marsh looked away, toward the window where gray light filtered through. "That is being negotiated. Some will face trial, the most visible, the ones whose roles cannot be hidden. But others, particularly those with specialized knowledge, are being offered arrangements. Immunity, exchange for cooperation, relocation, new identities, integration into American research programs." Hartley stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "This is obscene. These men are war criminals, mass murderers, and we are going to give them immunity? Give them jobs?" Marsh met his gaze steadily. "I do not make these decisions, Chaplain. I am simply the messenger. But I will tell you this. The world is changing. The alliance that defeated Japan is already fracturing. The Soviets are pursuing their own programs, gathering their own data. If we do not secure this knowledge, they will. And in the calculus of the new war, the Cold One, that knowledge could mean the difference between security and vulnerability. Hartley turned away, staring at the wall. The anger boiling inside him had nowhere to go. He thought of WWII, of the other survivors who had trusted him with their stories. He thought of the cells, the tables, the jars of preserved organs, and now he was being told that it was all acceptable, all justified, because the knowledge was useful? "What do you want from me?" he asked quietly. Marsh sighed. "Honesty, I suppose. I wanted you to hear this from someone who understands the moral dimensions. Most of the officers involved in these negotiations view it purely strategically. They do not lose sleep. But I do. And I suspect you will as well. I thought you deserved to know before the official announcements begin." Hartley turned back. "When will that be?" "Soon. The tribunal will proceed with its high-profile cases. But the scientists, the doctors, most will never see a courtroom. Their files will be sealed. Their crimes will become classified. And in a few years, no one will remember their names." "What about the victims? What about justice for them?" Marsh stood, gathering papers into a briefcase. "Justice is a luxury, Chaplain. We are living in a time of necessities. I wish I had a better answer for you." After Marsh left, Hartley sat alone in the empty office for a long time. The light faded. Shadows lengthened. He felt hollowed out, as though something essential had been carved from him. He had believed, naively perhaps, that the end of the war would bring clarity. Good would be rewarded, evil would be punished. The world would realign itself along moral lines. Instead, he was learning that the world operated on principles far more complicated and far less comforting. Pragmatism trumped principle. Strategy outweighed morality, and the suffering of thousands could be rendered footnotes in the larger narrative of geopolitical maneuvering. Over the following weeks, Hartley watched events unfold with a mixture of resignation and quiet fury. The tribunal proceeded, prosecuting leaders like General Hideki Tojo and others whose names were known to the public. These men were symbols, scapegoats in a way, bearing the collective guilt of the nation. Their trials were thorough, their convictions almost certain. They would hang, and the world would feel that justice had been served. But behind the scenes, the real architects of the experimental programs were quietly being processed through a different system. Hartley obtained copies of some of the agreements through contacts in intelligence. The documents were chilling in their bureaucratic language. Subject agrees to provide full disclosure of research methodologies. In exchange, subject will receive immunity from prosecution and financial compensation. Subject will relocate to the United States and assume new identity under program oversight. He learned that at least 15 scientists had accepted such deals. They would be smuggled out of Japan, brought to facilities in Maryland and Utah and New Mexico, where they would continue their work under American supervision. Their knowledge of biological warfare, of human tolerances to disease and toxin, would be integrated into American defense research. The rationale was simple and brutal. Better we have them than the Soviets. Hartley tried to intervene. He wrote letters to his superiors, to congressmen whose names he pulled from directories, to anyone he thought might listen. He argued that immunity for mass murderers set a dangerous precedent, that it betrayed the principles for which the war had been fought, that it dishonored the memory of those who had suffered. The responses, when they came, were polite but dismissive. "Thank you for your concern. The matter is under advisement. Decisions are being made at the highest levels with full consideration of all factors." In other words, His input was unwelcome. The machine had made its choice. In January, Hartley was reassigned. His services as a chaplain were no longer required in the investigative capacity. He was to return to regular duties, ministering to troops, conducting services, offering spiritual guidance. It was a clear message. Stop asking questions. Stop making noise. Accept the reality and move on. Before leaving Tokyo, Hartley made one final visit to the detention facility where some of the scientists were being held pending their processing. He wanted to look them in the eye, to understand, if possible, what kind of men could do what they had done and then accept immunity without apparent remorse. He was granted permission to interview Dr. Hideaki Tanaka one last time. Tanaka had been one of the first to accept a deal. He would be leaving for America within the month, his past erased, his future secured. They met in a small room, bare except for a table and 2 chairs. A guard stood outside, disinterested. Tanaka entered calmly, his expression neutral. He wore simple civilian clothes, clean and pressed. He looked, Hartley thought, like any middle-aged professional. There was nothing monstrous in his appearance, nothing that would mark him as a man who had dissected living prisoners. "Chaplain," Tanaka said, inclining his head slightly. "I did not expect to see you again." Hartley gestured to the chair. "I wanted to ask you something before you leave. You are going to America. You will live there, work there, perhaps raise a family there. How do you reconcile that with what you did?" Tanaka sat, folding his hands on the table. Reconcile is an interesting word. It implies a conflict that must be resolved. I do not see it that way. What I did was in service to my country. My country lost. Now I serve a new master. The work continues. Do you feel nothing for the people you hurt, the lives you destroyed? Tanaka considered this. I feel many things, Chaplain. Regret that we lost. Curiosity about what my new work will entail. Concern for my family's well-being. But guilt? No. Guilt requires belief that one has done something wrong. I was a soldier following orders. If my actions were wrong, then the wrongness lies with those who gave the orders, not with me. Hartley leaned forward. That is a coward's answer. You had agency. You made choices. Everyone makes choices within constraints, Tanaka replied. You chose to become a chaplain, to serve in the military. Were you not also following directives? Were you not also part of a system that caused suffering? The distinction you draw between us is one of degree, not kind. The comparison made Hartley's blood boil. There is a vast difference between serving in combat and torturing prisoners in a laboratory. To you, perhaps. To me, both are manifestations of war. War is inherently barbaric. The only question is how honest one is about that fact. I was honest. I did what was necessary without pretense of nobility. You, Chaplain, wrapped your participation in the language of duty and faith, but the outcome was the same. People died. Hartley stood, unable to continue. The conversation had become a mirror he did not want to look into. Tanaka's logic was perverse, but it contained a sliver of uncomfortable truth. Everyone involved in war, in some way, bore responsibility for its horrors. The question was where one drew the line, and whether that line held any meaning when the consequences were tallied. As he left the detention facility, Hartley felt exhausted in a way that went beyond physical fatigue. He had come seeking understanding, perhaps even a glimpse of remorse. Instead, he had encountered a man utterly at peace with his actions, a man who viewed morality as a construct rather than an absolute. It was, in its way, more disturbing than...
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.